we are back with another exciting edition, another art-driven edition of Content Minded. And this is an episode that is quite important to me and quite close to me as a Canadian artist, not just an artist in Canada, but, someone I think, it's something I'll talk about when it comes to the fraught nature of identity. So before we get into it, let me do the business of shilling, because for some reason I think I don't. The YouTube algorithm essentially punishes everyone, but blesses certain people and suppresses others. And I noticed that I think my views have been down, or notifications or whatever. The system is inherently broken. So please like, share, and subscribe. Spread the word if you can by sharing or telling your friends. Or I've had people that are even married, or they've said, "Well, I show my wife or my husband your content," and I go, "Oh my God, that's something else." So yeah, if you click the bell, I know I even feel dirty just saying it, but if you can click the bell to get my content on the regular. I think when I took a little bit of a summer break, that probably didn't do any favors to the YouTube algorithm. And of course, if you want to support my work, I give hours upon hours of absolute gemerald Kino content on patreon.com/genreproductions and substack.com/Gio's Content Corner. Both are only $5 a month. And, you could donate more. There's other options on Patreon, so on and so forth. And I think Substack gives you the option of contributing more, or a yearly sum or something like that. Or I have to look into it. But anyways, that's for the full thing. And I wanted to talk today about my experiences going this summer. I went with my girlfriend. We went to the McMichael Gallery. And I haven't been since I was a kid. And it was a very foundational experience. In a way, I would say, as an artist myself in Canada, it was almost, I'm debating whether I want to say the term religious experience, because I don't want to cheapen that language. But I would use the term religious experience, or I would say a sacred experience for me, because the McMichael Gallery represents so much of what visual art in Canada actually means. And especially as someone who is a landscape painter, who does plein air painting, which is outdoor painting, to follow in the footsteps, knowing that I'll probably never live up to their greatness, but to follow in the footsteps of the Group of Seven and their various associate artists like Emily Carr, and to see their works in person, and to really sit there and gaze upon works that I've seen literally since I was a little kid, in various places, in school, in Canadian documentaries, on television, and so on and so forth. And to actually bear witness to the artwork that I live in the shadow of, as most Canadian artists do, whether they want to admit it or not, whether they live in the shadow of the Group of Seven to embrace them, or, as I might discuss, to chide and castigate them, as is the popular trend. But I don't want to get too much. Inevitably, just by nature of the content and by nature of the show and by nature of what's going on in Canada, there will be, I think, political salience somewhat. But I think what I want to do is I don't want to make it only about the sort of quiet cultural war over what it means to be a Canadian or Canadian identity. Because I think the work of art speaks for itself in terms of not just the Group of Seven, but other artists I'm going to talk about, creating the sort of foundational elements of a truly and uniquely Canadian culture, which is something that has been left wanting for a long time now, ever since the social and political experiment of Trudeau Sr. And so I think it behooves me to not just laser focus on, which is something I think unfortunately a lot of my co-content creators of a variety of political stripes, but let's say mostly on the online right or conservatives, tend to solely focus on the sort of political salience to whatever cultural export or cultural element or artistic medium or practice that they're talking about, mostly in film. But I think that I would like to give my audiences something more than just using art, be it film, literature, visual art, as a sort of conveyor belt for political hot takes. I think that there's something, I don't know, because I don't want to criticize people, but at the same time, there is sort of like an elitist impulse in me to say that some of that's a bit vulgar. You know what I mean? I'm not particularly criticizing people that do that. Some content creators do this that I quite enjoy. But I think as an artist, my mission is something else. I think that it would do more of a service to take the work of art as I see it and as it comes to us and to me. And then you can haggle over various political interpretations as you will. Because some works of art, as I will touch upon in the McMichael Gallery, I saw are inherently political. Or rather have a political salience because of the discourse and the academic language that has been placed upon them. Or rather gravitates around the actual works of art. Which I think is fine to talk about. And I may have a bit of a different take than what some people would expect when it comes to the nature of, for example, Indigenous art, which I will talk about at great length in this podcast. But just to lay out a basic structure, I want to talk about, first and foremost, my experiences in the McMichael Gallery and some papers I came across talking specifically about the Group of Seven, one of which was written by the luminary of the Group of Seven himself, A.Y. Jackson, another one of my favorite artists, which was an address to, I believe, one particular Canadian society, or it was, I believe, the group of Canadian artists or Canadian painters themselves, which expanded outwards away from the Group of Seven. For example, Emily Carr, another one of my favorite artists, she wasn't a part of the Group of Seven, but did shows with them and more commingled with them in terms of various stylistic choices of hers. And they had a sort of kindred spirit, if you will, being around the same time. Of course, I believe most of the Group of Seven, or all of them, were in Ontario. And don't quote me on that one. But she was out in British Columbia. So I'll go through those academic papers. Another one, so there's that one which was more of an address by A.Y. Jackson on the nature of Canadian art as it was developing at the time. And the second paper was very interesting. It's written by an academic, but it quotes at length the writings of the famed avant-garde abstract filmmaker Stan Brakhage. And he's really one of my favorite filmmakers because he approached the medium of film like an abstract expressionist. And some of his films are quite brilliant and fascinating and beautiful. And even the ones that covered more morose topics have a beauty to them. And I know, like, nowadays people view it as, oh, that's Criterion Core. That's like what people, that pretend to be artur film enjoyers and intellectuals. But, sometimes you have to give yourself a space to feel a sense of enculturation that escapes these sort of mass media-ized, especially in the internet age, to escape both irony poisoning, but also a sort of sappy sincerity that people claim they like, but really criticize people putting this, put on it from this, ironically detached position. That makes sense. So in other words, you have to avoid the extreme of total full-blown sincerity to the point of cringe. But also I think that it's a very easy criticism to make of like, oh, you enjoy these things because you're pretending. But there's like a middle way, if you will. Because a lot of people that have like letterbox accounts and enjoy obscure European film and auteur filmmaking, a lot of them are just doing it to pretend. And a lot of them don't have very deep perspectives or thoughts on what they're consuming, even if it is high art, whether it be visual art such as film or painting or literature. They don't really have a higher opinion besides what some video essayist on YouTube told them to think and feel about whatever particular film or work of art. But at the same time, there are people that are genuine, and I think to castigate people for being genuinely interested in higher things smacks of a sort of like, I think, older, more like 1980s, 1990s version of like postmodern society, where you're criticizing people but at the same time you're putting on this like intellectual front or conceit towards pop culture or mass slop. Because that is a distinction of postmodern society, is this collapse of higher and lower culture. So sometimes I think even as a podcaster, you have to sort of give yourself space to enjoy higher things in a sincere manner. Even though it may give you a certain degree of social brownie points. Like we all know the myth, the stereotype of the Redditor. But at the same time, I think that, as I was saying a few minutes ago, a lot of people that do sort of culture war commentary, they just take the work of art as a political act or a political product that can then be haggled over in terms of some ongoing culture war discourse online, which is something that I don't want to do. I mean, I've done plenty of it in my life, and I still continue to do it to an extent, but I'm not like a saint in this regard. But I feel that, especially when I'm talking about something so deep and personal and heartfelt to me as a Canadian, I think it warrants a more serious discussion. So let me start with, and I'll talk a little bit about my own problems of identity when it comes to Canada itself. But lastly, before I get into my experiences at the McMichael, I'll just warn people that, not warn, but I'll remind people that the state of Canada as it is now is not a very good one. And there's a lot of problems that I even talk about quite a bit. But the reason I think it's important to talk about these things, to talk about true Canadian art, is because it delivers you into a realm of the sort of spiritual foundations of our nation that I think has the potential to break free of current, rather depressing political and socio-economic realities of living in current day Canada. And so I feel that it is, in some ways, when I was going to this gallery, I even said this to my girlfriend, I feel like I am in a spiritual place, and I feel like it's something that I have to do. I have to record this journey. I have to relive encountering these artists for the first time, well, since I was a very young kid. And I didn't have the sort of faculties to understand the presence of the place that I'm in and the presence of these works of art that have, in a lot of very unconscious ways, influenced who I am as an artist, and sometimes very conscious ways, in terms of how I've spent a lot of time greatly studying artists like Tom Thompson and A.Y. Jackson and Emily Carr and Lauren Harris. And so, yeah, let me just say that, yes, the state of modern Canada is very bad for a variety of reasons. And I fear that things will get worse. But I refuse to go down the path I went when I was younger, perhaps more naive, perhaps more jaded and black-pilled. I mean, I still am kind of black-pilled, but the path of total scorn that I had when I was younger, in my early 20s, my teens and early 20s, where my impulse was to just totally write off Canada. We are the post national place, rootless economic zone, and nothing's coming to save us, and there's nothing of value left, and anything that was once great about this country has been left to ruins. And I might as well just pack up and go and live in America, because that's the only place in the Western world where you could still have, explicitly whatever types of policies, blah, 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 and so there was a sense in which, and I'm not pouring scorn in America. I mean, there's obviously a lot of problems with America. There's a lot of great things about America as well. And who knows, maybe out of necessity, I might have to spend more time there one day. But I feel like that sort of youthful vigor meeting my inherently, what should you say, inherently, at that time at least, inherently depressive, despair-ridden character. It's very funny. People have the total opposite picture of me. But when I was younger, yeah, it was real. I feel like my impulse was, and I think a lot of it was because I was consuming a lot of mainstream conservative media here in Canada, where it led me to the conclusion of like total despair and total blackpilling and saying that there's nothing left to save in this place. But as time goes on, and some of it was because I think in terms of my own identity as an Italian, and my mother's an Ellis Islander. My father's family's been here for a long time, but not as long as even relatives that I have. By marriage, I mean. Like my one uncle, whose family's been here for almost 300 years. And a lot of it was like, well, what's left for me here? But at the same time, I think that now that I've looked at things in hindsight, and I think that I can approach things with a bit more tact and sophistication. I mean, even that word sophistication immediately is like, you have this like ironic impulse to be like, distance yourself from it, because it's like, I'm being pretentious. And that's an evil sin, to be pretentious. But like Francis Ford Coppola said once in the documentary that he was making while he was making Apocalypse Now, it's called A Filmmaker's Apocalypse. He goes, you have this thing where you don't want to be pretentious. It's evil. It's terrible being pretentious. But as an artist, as a filmmaker, you have to allow yourself the space to be pretentious. Because you know that what's going to come out at the other end has the potentiality to be great. So even using that word pretentious is an inner psyop. It's psyoping yourself, which is a point I'm leading to here, which is I feel like a lot of this like mainstream conservative media in Canada, and you see this with like what people have termed the maple MAGA people, that has this like inherent like worship of America and worship of another nation in the Middle East, and worship of like this like despair-ridden black-pilling view of Canada, and it's like, aren't we just better off as America? We might as well be America. And I think a lot of that mainstream like Sun News, and a lot of great things I read when I was growing up. They had a lot of good writers, but I think a lot of the sort of National Post, Sun Media, rebel media, Ezra Levant sphere type of content, who knows if a lot of that could be a psyop to sort of say to you, instead of developing a sense of greatness, and it doesn't have to be just politically right-wing, I mean in general, because the problem in Canada is that Canadian nationalism has been bundled up, ironically enough, with things that are very anti-nationalist and very anti a sense of what a Canadian identity is. And there's something, even though I know he's a Kohler and I don't agree with him politically in a lot of things, and I think like he can have a lot of spurious conclusions about things, but that was a thesis of that J.J. McClellan guy that I think was pretty apt, which is that a lot of Canadian nationalism on the political left has been connoted with the sense of an anti-identity. It is nationalism via negativa. That often is, we're not America. But at the other end, on the so-called right in Canada, which is the sort of right side of liberalism, the way that the Republican Party and certain segments of MAGA even, and the sort of tradition of neoconservatism and like William F. Buckley National Review style conservatism in America is the right side of liberalism. In Canada, it's even more transparent that it is a right side of liberalism conservatism that only focuses on economic issues, that selectively focuses on certain geopolitical concerns because the left is like, I don't know, pro-Palestine or whatever, that it's designed to prevent you from thinking about any other possibility. And for years, decades, what a lot of these people in the National Post and Rebel Media and so on and so forth, what they've given you is this total black pill to be like, we're never gonna escape America, but at the same time, you know, what is a Canadian really? So they're implicitly buying into, from the conservative side, the thesis that there's no such thing as a Canadian identity, and wouldn't we be just better off as Americans? Whereas the left gives you, you know, intense anti-Americanism, especially under Trump, but not only are we like better than America, but also we are nothing at all. We are the first post-national, state-mandated multicultural society, and our past is riddled with horrors and terror, and it's evil, but at the same time, we're not America. We're also morally superior to that. But when it comes to the notion of what a Canadian is, or what the foundational history of Canada is, that's also evil and terrible. It's very contradictory, both sides of them. I know I'm like playing off this like I'm not a centrist by any means, but I think like I'm doing the like, in a weird way, I don't want to say the term third position, that because that term has been, you know, very politically loaded. But I think in terms of doing a both sidesism, I'm doing that definitely. But I think that the more insidious reality, the more insidious side, is the one of the normie mainstream conservative in Canada. Because they don't present you any vision of what you should be angling for, what you should be positioning yourself as a Canadian for. What they're giving you is like tepid, warmed over, like normie Republican conservative Fox News talking points, but they're also giving you like this endless stream. And there's a lot of blackpilling things in Canada. I know I said I didn't want to talk about politics, but I'm going to get to the meat of this podcast. But I think it's important to do this preamble, for the sense that they give you nothing at all. The way that the left in Canada gives you nothing at all. The way that the mainstream political Laurentian elite class gives you nothing at all in terms of what you should think and feel and believe in your bones to be Canadian history and what Canada really is. Because what they give you is a demoralization tactic psyop that says, aren't you just better off as American? In fact, the wokeism is more correct. There's no such thing as Canada. It's like people that have spurious identities themselves, if they're really coming from Western nations, those like big sloppy-list accounts on Twitter or on YouTube or wherever, on TikTok, they're like, you know, Europe is done for, Britain's done for, Canada's done for, Australia's done for. And they have this like an implicit like pro-American like Trump worship type of thing going on, but that's a foil to give you the demoralization of Europe, UK, Canada, Australia, so on and so forth, etc., is done for. And there's nothing you could do. And I'm not saying like I'm not advocating any mass demonstration or violence or whatever. I'm an artist, I'm a writer, I'm a podcaster. That's not my position to give you a political public policy or in real life action plan. I'm not doing that. But I'm saying that for a long time, when I was younger, I was susceptible to this. As a lot of younger people who feel on the outs with, Canadian society or even in the rest of the Western world. I can't speak to people in the non-Western world, but I'm sure a similar phenomenon happens where you are a younger person that feels disenfranchised by the social and political order, and so therefore you find an escape in any which way that it's provided to you. But a lot of the sort of like rebel media stuff where they were pumping these, youth influencers into the American media market space, a lot of it, they don't give you anything real that's positive. They do a good job at highlighting the decay and highlighting the political abasement of Canadian society. But what do they fill it with? They fill it with political and social and cultural categories that are not uniquely Canadian, that might as well be American. And so I think that it took me a long time to realize this, but when I did, I'm like, wow, maybe it was a psyop. Maybe Ezra Levant and all those people, maybe it was a psyop. It got disaffected mostly male Canadians who look at the world around them and realize that things are falling apart, and it doesn't give you any sense of what you should be advocating for, but rather the same old endless appeal to what people are now calling slopulism, the same old rhetoric and the same old Fox News talking points, and the same old despair-ridden message of, there's nothing left in Canada. Canada's done for. And therefore, and now with Trump and this whole thing as of late, is it any wonder a lot of them feel so riddled with despair and lack of political agency? Which, by the way, I'm not totally castigating. I think a lot of it is a legitimate concern. But at the same time, you have to, this whole thing of like, no wonder that they're going down this primrose path of capitulating and saying that maybe we are better off as Americans. The sort of Maple MAGA, Western secession type of thing. Which, I mean, there's a lot of good people that are a part of the Alberta exit thing, and I'm not totally casting shade on anybody on the right, but I think it's a wrong-headed approach because a lot of it has been informed by mainstream conservative media, like, and Ezra Levant obviously is one of the worst culprits in this, that don't give you anything besides just highlighting the problems and despairing over them and saying things are going to get worse, which I've said in at the time of recording, me and Prudentialist and Digital Archipelago, we talked about this in relation to the Mytho-American article, The Aesthetics of the End, where a lot of it I could recall when I was younger in the 2000s. A lot of that media, they always said things are going to get worse, and guess what? Things got worse. And there was nothing presented to you besides putting like little public policy stopgaps in them, or some kind of like nebulous, like we got to raise awareness type of thing. But if you don't have a sense of who you are as a Canadian, the way that American media, even like the most mainstream, like APAC, NatCon, Fox News, Republican Party, even they still have a sense of what an American is, what the myth of the cult of the Founding Fathers and Americana. Like, I mean, it's a very fuzzy and, well, even still is subject to the machinations of postmodernism. However fuzzy or subject to mission creep or whatever that idea of Americana is, it's still something. Conservative media in Canada, what little of it there is, doesn't even give you that. Doesn't even talk about Canadiana. And so it's the job of people who I think have, broken from that paradigm. And I think that's what I want to do here, is to give you a foundation as an artist, as the best I can speak to Canada and the soul of Canada. The best I can do as an artist is speak to it from what I know, which is the work of art that this nation has produced, that I have lived in the shadow of. And so, end rant. Let's go to my experiences at the McMichael Gallery. But let's take a little bit of a music break just to give you a little reprieve from the polemical hot take that I've offered. Hot takes I've offered. So let's get to it. All right, so we are back, and let me go over some of my experiences within the McMichael Gallery. There's actually a plein air competition that I might apply for. You have to, of course, either do a piece on location on the grounds. They have an absolutely beautiful trail and grounds, or around Kleinberg. And I might, if I don't get a chance to go up there when it's over, probably next year, definitely next year, I will do it. Not that I'm like the greatest plein air painter ever, but I don't know. I mean, it feels good to enter something. I mean, maybe that's my problem. But anyways, so you go into the hall of the gallery and you're immediately greeted by a number of drawings, a number of Indigenous drawings. I believe it's called Divided Heavens. And I'm going to like totally butcher this name. But so I'm not trying to be facetious or disrespectful. But I believe it's called Early Heavens by Kananganak Patuguk. It sounds too similar to a racial slur, so I'm not going to, but he's an incredible draftsman and artist, and I'm going to I'll talk a little bit later, because in the gallery they had a number of other Indigenous artists, some of which are not exactly quality, but the stuff from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, I believe some of them were from the 80s and the early 2000s. They were quite stunning drawings. And some of them were prints, of course. They had a number of quite famous Indigenous statues or carvings. A lot of them were made with whalebone. And then they had Iris Hostler, Divided Heavens. So that's her one. And her installations, I didn't get too much of a look for it because I was, laser focused on going into the Group of Seven section. But Divided Heavens is actually pretty good. A lot of her sculptures are pretty good. And the Indigenous drawings I'll talk a little bit more later. But then on the wall that led to the media room, where they have a continuous loop, I believe you can find the video on their YouTube channel, was by Sandra Brewster, called Fish, Site-Specific Installation. And I was kind of like, Worlds on Paper. That's the first Indigenous one I saw. Drawings from Kinngait. And that was pretty good. I believe one drawing I want to talk about in particular is from that. But the Sandra Brewster one was interesting because, I want to take a break. I sat in the media room, the little theater they had, and it was like your typical, I'm an immigrant, my family's from Guyana, and it was sort of like, what you're going to get, right? But in terms of her installation, which was a collage/drawing where she did these I'm assuming charcoal drawings or ink drawings of fishes, and along with multimedia collages of riverbeds above and cityscapes. And they said, they used a gel medium, or they used a gel to adhere it to the wall. But then I saw the video and she was using Liquitex medium, something I am very familiar with. But it was pretty good. There were really good drawings, and the collage art was very apt. But I think they had to gussy it up a bit with the whole immigrant story, which I think to me, the art, when I was viewing that video, and you have to realize the McMichael Gallery, even the little cafe stuff where you can order food, they're catering to an middle to upper middle class, largely boomer clientele. And so, very quiet audience, and people that, maybe one day will buy some of my landscape paintings, who knows. So I think the art to me spoke for itself. I quite enjoyed that huge installation on this very narrow section, narrow in terms of height, but in terms of width, it was quite a monumental work. I quite enjoyed it. And I think, like, I understand, like, the life of the artist is important, but attaching all of that is sort of like, anyways. I'll skip ahead to the drawings from Kinngait because I wanted to talk more about the Group of Seven exhibition, the exhibit that they had. Some of them a lot of them came off as outsider art, which, they got, they basically are. I mean, that term outsider art is a very hotly debated term. But some of them you could tell, like, in terms of the draftsmanship, it was like, so-so. But then some of them were quite stunning and amazing. Especially the ones of the cranes and of the snow geese. And some of the drawings, a lot of them left to be desired, but then they had a few landscape drawings in this Kinngait exhibit that, even though they were rough around the edges, even though you could tell, like, it was outside art or whatever, they were great. They were fascinating. And they utilized, there was this one I was looking at in particular, and it was snowbanks covering these, like, sort of like village houses, and there was a few, like, barren trees. You could tell that this is essentially the northernest part of Canada. And I remember looking at that, and it's from, Dorset Island, near Fox Peninsula, southern tip of Baffin Island in Nunavut. I had a friend, actually, that went there. Anyways, I saw this landscape. It was quite large. You could tell it was a large piece of paper, and it was very horizontal. It was very, like, panoramic landscape size. And I was staring at that for a good 2-3 minutes because of the navigation of space. Because there's not much to the drawing. There's not much to it in terms of, like, the actual inscription of the artistic mark. But the space it created in that barren land of the northernest, most north part of Canada. And I just looked at that, and it was incredible. It's something, it's, even though a lot of these people, these Inuit artists that contributed to this Kinngait exhibition, you could tell, like, some of them, maybe they're not trained or they're amateurs or whatever, but they're working, and this is the beauty of outside art, and this is why I intellectually understand the arguments in terms of the sort of, like, whatever academic terms it invokes, colonialism and so on and so forth, or sort of like Western-centric, Eurocentric art forms and the ateliers and art school and so on and so forth. I understand the sort of critique of the term outsider art. But if you just look at these drawings for what they are, if you allow your mind, because, I'm on the fence. I think that the analysis and the genealogy and the history of the work of art and its social and cultural context is important, but at the same time, I think that there is an argument to be made of just allowing the piece of art, the work of art, to speak for itself on its own terms as an aesthetic object. And you could tell that someone who probably didn't go to art school, and I know I want to avoid, like, the language of, like, reifying, like, oh my God, these, primitive people, oh my God, they're doing such great things. In a way that, like, very fuddy-duddy type of, like well-meaning liberal types, the libbies, as Norman Mailer called them, can be, like, well-meaning, but at the same time are nowadays in the 2020s or the 2010s viciously criticized by, like, woke academics, for lack of a better term, even though their level of cultural acceptance or their level of cultural openness is very high, but that's not the point, because they're, like, they're trying to, like, mythologize them in a weird, semi-mediaized way based off of popular depictions, and they're trying to do, like, the noble savage thing. So I understand, like, it's like, okay, am I racist for saying I like certain works and I think certain works are amateurish? Or am I racist for saying all of it's good and I'm doing the noble savage thing? Like, you can't win, right? So in the absence of winning, I think I'll say that some of the works I did not enjoy. I think they were too amateurish, they were too cartoonish, they were kind of childlike, which I guess is kind of the point, right? But then there are other works that I found were quite stunning, even though they may not have had a professional polish, but they were stunning nevertheless. There was one of an Inuit, I believe, chasing a seal down a sort of rock embankment with snow, and I believe it was from, I want to say, the 1980s. And I remember looking at it, and I had this instant flashback to some, like, National Film Board documentary of the Inuit I watched when I was a kid in school. And I remember, like, man, that was a great one. And again, the aesthetic quality that I want to emphasize is this navigation of space. This landscape in that embankment one of the Inuit, and the color, you could tell that the pelt coats were given great detail because these people live that life, you know. And it's, in a way, the navigation of empty space, or notan, stark contrast of, you know, black and white, which is in Japan called notan, or the sort of the wu wei, as it is known in Taoist literati painting in China, which is the empty space, or the letting be, or the letting breathing, the what Heidegger would call the unconcealment and concealment of space in absence. Things that are in absence in a lot of different artistic mediums, in visual mediums, sometimes creates greater depth than what is there that is present, what is the mark that is made by pen, by watercolor, by ink, by paint. The marks that are not there is often better, especially the medium watercolor. And these amateur, you know, outsider indigenous artists, again, not to venture into the noble savage thing, but they achieved a mastery of space that a lot of watercolorists, and having done quite a bit of watercolor in my life, is very, very hard to capture. It's very hard to treat watercolor, especially in a northern climate, as a sketch that breaks forth an image by using a lot of negative space of the whiteness of the paper. It's very hard because as an artist, there's almost like this like homunculus at the back of your skull that is telling you to add more, add more, add more. And, you know, my approach to watercolor is very additive because I use a lot of white gouache to make a lot, especially when I'm doing sketches outdoors. I use a lot of white gouache to make it more opaque, to transform any color into gouache paint, which is opaque and can be added on as highlights. And a lot of times, you know, you'll use either gouache or even acrylic paint or something, or gel pens, to give highlights in very small places that are kind of difficult to ignore, or to unless you're using masking fluid. But I don't like using masking fluid because it has like this very garish type of thing where it's like you have to like tone it down a bit with a very, very thin wash. So I don't really like using masking fluid. I'd rather just add a highlight because of this painterly instinct that I have. But so sometimes it's very hard to maintain negative space while you're doing a painting in watercolor, especially outdoors, when you don't have a lot of time and you have to make a lot of very quick decisions. So, you know, you use gouache or something else, gel pens to highlight. But the mastery of negative space that these landscapes in this Kinngait exhibition, I quite enjoyed. I think some of them were amazing. And the landscapes and the people in the landscapes, and now that I'm instead of like routing back to it, I know people find that somewhat annoying because that's the way my brain works, is that I'll like, you know, I'll touch upon a topic, then I'll go back to it. So let me just talk about the Indigenous stuff first, and then we'll get to the group of seven, and then we'll get to a very like pleasant surprise. This exhibit called Morrice in Venice, who was a member of the Group of Seven, James Wilson Morrice. He traveled to Venice. I believe he stayed there for a few months, and he did these amazing plein air paintings, which I'll cover a bit. So especially of young women or women in general, he would see walking up and down the piazza and up and down the banks of the channels. So let me just talk about the Indigenous stuff first, and then I'll get to the Group of Seven, Morrice in Venice. And that has a tie-in, and I'll tell you why it has a tie-in. The one part that I did not like of the gallery, I'll talk about that in the Group of Seven stuff. So then this one gallery or exhibit by I cannot pronounce his name, but I will probably put it in the description. Kinngait Patuguk. He had these stunning illustrations. I believe he was trained as an artist, and a lot of them were, I would say, some of the wildlife was the equivalent of Audubon. They were that great. Some of these, some of them are a bit more simplistic, but the ones that I saw there were incredible. And the snowbirds, the snow geese, and the Canadian geese, and there were some landscapes from him as well. But again, a lot of it was centered around the tradition of Canadian wildlife art and painting that was then revolutionized by later artists like Robert Bateman. But his stuff from the 70s and 80s, I believe. Is he still alive? Let me look this up really quick, if he's still alive. No, he died in 2010, unfortunately. But his stuff from the later half of the 20th century was incredible. And the one image that I really focused on, and I believe they also had his, is that his daughter? Or his wife, Annie, who was also part of Kinngait. I believe they both were from Kinngait. And her drawings were quite incredible as well. Oh, sorry, Annie was his niece. And in terms of Inuit art, they're probably some of the best representations of Inuit art in Canada. There was one piece in particular that really struck me. There was a few of them. One was two geese in the typical Inuit parka. And the depiction of it is, in some ways kind of garish and unsettling the way you see any anthropomorphized animal. But then there was this one where a fully fleshed out goose or snowbird had its wings pointing towards the left of the frame. And another one, so it was on the left-hand side, and then the other one on the right-hand side was an anthropomorphized goose in the Inuit clothing, like sitting down on the ground. And I remember I had this conversation with my GF at the time. We were sitting in front of it. And that, like, very clean drawing or illustration, it was very subtle. But in a way you could see a form of transubstantiation or transcendence going on in the piece. And it was a sort of quiet transformation or transubstantiation of form from man to animal in the way that is represented in a lot of animist spiritualities throughout the world. But in such a place as the Great North, you don't need a very present, very fully fleshed out, dreamlike or psychedelic even representation of spirituality. or the way it is in, for example, Renaissance Catholic art. You have the hierarchy of saints, you have the celestial bodies, you have cherubs and angels appearing from the clouds. You have in Greek iconography the representation in various blue hues or golden light of the sort of uncreated light, preternatural light. Whereas in this representation, this Inuit animism, you have a visual depiction of the transformation of the body, of the self, into an animal form. That is very subtle, doesn't involve a lot of dramatic or theatrical depictions of that transformation, but a sort of quiet or silent giving over to the animal spirit. And I thought that was fascinating. That was fascinating. In a sense of being such a minimalistic and dramatic departure from our, Western or Christian or whatever understanding of transformation in a spiritual context. And I remember, like to me, that was very fascinating. The way that the goose was pointing to the left of itself, its wings splayed out, and right next to it is this man, this chimera-like creature. And the way that you could see the implication of that spiritual practice in very little, imagistic space. And so to me, I thought that was quite fascinating indeed. And then another fascinating thing, an exhibit in the McMichael that I was very fond of and was anticipating seeing they had in the attic, was the retrospective of Norval Morrisseau, who truly is one of the greats, or was one of the greats of Canadian art. And let me talk a little bit about it, because I know this is a very contentious issue when it comes to Indigenous art and Indigenous representations of spiritual practices. To me, what was made clear, and I know this is sort of laden with politics and current events in Canada in a way that I'll explain. Before I went to the attic, which is this huge long hall, and I saw this exhibit by Norval Morrisseau, and I believe they have even more paintings of his, but these were the ones that were on offer. There were a lot of his floral works, there were a lot of his famous works of fish, and then there was one in particular, which was, I believe, called a shaman dreaming, or a shaman speaking to, I believe it was either a fish or a representation of a flower. Because Norval Morrisseau had converted to Christianity. Well, he was exposed to Christian thought from a very early age. Was it his uncle or his aunt that was a shaman that taught him how to paint? And I should really do an episode just on Morrisseau himself. I should really do one on him, another Man of Art episode. But near the end of his life, he fully committed to Christianity. He had this very syncretic or fusionistic approach to spirituality, as himself being recognized as a great man of spirit and a great shaman within his Indigenous tradition. He was an Anishinaabe, or an Ojibwe, as it is popularly known. But he still had this, despite all the history and the trauma and the residential school thing, he had this reverence for the sort of Christian tradition as well. He was a product of the residential school system, but yet when he survived this hotel fire in 1972, he started incorporating a lot of Christian themes in his work, and there was something that was quite beautiful and something that only Canada can really produce. I was almost on the verge of tears looking at his artwork. He truly is a transcendental figure. But the beginning, and I'll talk some about the pieces I saw, but in the beginning, right smack dab in the middle of the group of seven was a contemporary piece by Ken Mockman. And of course, he doesn't paint a lot of his larger works, but I believe this was a smaller one that he actually painted, where it was in a residential school, and it was like these beds. You could tell people were sleeping in them. You could only see their feet, and a little child looking out of a gated window, and there's a cross, of course, in the middle of the room, and it has, I mean, in terms of a period piece, it had the clothing and it had the room structure. It was down pat, right? And you could tell. I remember having this conversation where I'm like, at the time, you could tell what he's trying to do. And this piece was from 2021, I think. Yeah, 2021. Where it's like the child trying to escape from the suppressive residential school system. And it's like, okay, fine. I understand the context as an Aboriginal himself, you know. But you have to realize the context of that piece. That was when churches were burning. Almost 100, I think over 100 churches burned as a result of certain, let's say, dubious or yet to be fully fleshed out claims of certain lingo of mass, you know what. I don't know what I could say for you two. And, you know, you could tell why they put that there. Why there was only one Mockman painting that was put right in the middle of the group of seven exhibit. You could tell what they were doing, right? It was a thumb in the eye to the Canadian tradition of art. And it was like, you know, as a painting, it had symbolism. It was done very well. I don't particularly like his sort of like glassy, like contemporary figuration, very flat type of color matching when it comes to figuration. I'm not a big fan of his work. But of course he does these huge illustrative pieces, and I believe he has a whole team of artists that help him paint them. The Justin Trudeau, do not research the Justin Trudeau one. Do not research. I thought, out of all the works from Mockman, I think that one was probably the best one. But it's very evocative, put it that way. I can't describe it. You have to look at it. Actually, do not look it up. Do not research the Justin Trudeau Ken Mockman painting. But I thought like that was such a different contrast, the Mockman one and the Norval Morrisseau one. Because to me, Norval Morrisseau was doing something that transcended his conditions. Whereas Ken Mockman can only make political slop. Let's be real with you want me to not reify Indigenous art and to not do the whole like noble savage thing because that's also racist. I'm doing this right now. I'm doing it right now. Where I'm going to make a discrimination or a distinction in taste between two Indigenous artists that are in different ways important to the sort of pantheon of Canadian art. The Norval Morrisseau one, who is deeply relating to his spiritual tradition, but incorporating a tradition that is not his own, but he adopted, even through that history of traumatic relations with the Christian-run residential school system. Whereas Ken Mockman chooses to do a propagandistic depiction while the church is burned. He's doing this, putting it right smack dab in the middle of, I would argue, the spiritual center of Canadian art in the Group of Seven exhibition. I remember I was getting kind of pissed and my girlfriend was trying to calm me down, but then there was this other piece of Indigenous art where it was a sort of like an unabashed landscape where you could tell it was in the Athabascan sands, and it was and some of the colors were kind of very bright and vibrant, too bright for me in my style of painting. But they were traditional Indigenous Salish figures that were indicative of the mask work and the totems that you would find in British Columbia. There used to be this great series of Canadian art and different people doing photography and so forth called Landscape as Muse. And I think if you are a Canadian resident, There's this website that gives a lot of the episodes for free. I have to look this up again. But I think some of them are on YouTube. It's called Landscapism News. I used to watch it in the I think it was the documentary channel used to have it. I would record them, I would PVR them, and I'd watch them. And one of them was, I forget his name now, but he was one of the most popular mask carvers in British Columbia and in Canada. It was a great episode. But there were these masks, and they were on this almost like nocturne type of desert landscape. And my girlfriend goes to me, why do you like this one, but you don't like the Ken Lachman one? Even though the Ken Lachman one arguably has more technical skill. I go, well, think of it this way. Same with Norval Morrisseau. Norval Morrisseau. So I'm getting the names wrong. One is not really embracing the tradition as such that they are the physical living embodiment of. Now, I think that, not to get too hung up on it, I think the placement of the Monkman one was conscious and deliberate as a sort of recognition of, hey, we're representing Canadian art, but we know that it's racist settler colonialism. We know that the landscape painting tradition of Canada is an extension of the European mind and blah, 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 whatever. But it's not choosing, and yes, there is a lot of Monkman paintings that have traditional representations of Indigenous art and art practices and their, spiritual tradition. But that piece was not that. That was a polemic. That was a politicized representation while Christians were being persecuted in Canada, a lot of times not by Indigenous people themselves, but by, these white Antifa types. Although there were a lot of Indigenous people that were burning churches, I would imagine, as well. But I think, like, the average, like, not like the sort of activist ones you find in academia or the ones that go off to be lawyers to settle land claims or get, speaking positions at universities in the CBC. But I think, like, the average Indigenous person, the ones that I've met anyways, they're sort of like, they're not as activisty as you would imagine. And I think in America, the experience with Indigenous people is also different, right? Like, for example, a majority of Indigenous people in America voted for Trump. I mean, you know what I mean? Which is unthinkable in the Canadian context, because I think that we were closer to the Indigenous experience. You could argue that the American experience was even more G-word idle and depraved, and the Trail of Tears and all that stuff. Whereas in Canada, there is way more Indigenous people per capita than in America. And so it becomes more contentious. But the reason that I found the Monkman one more difficult than the other representations of Indigenous art is because, yes, it is valid to, I'm not defending the residential schools. I'm not saying that a lot of horrible things happened, or didn't happen. I'm not saying that it didn't happen, but the whole, like, mass, and the spurious connection to it, and the way that the evidence is presented of certain land anomalies in the ground, and the evocative framing by the Canadian media to deflect the obvious problems that were boiling to the surface of the Trudeau government at the time. The mercenary nature of it, the anti-Christian nature of it. I can't just stand by here as a Catholic myself and say, oh, it's understandable that churches burned. And a lot of it was Canadian libs, the Leaf libs, trying to, as I've said before, mimic the BLM riots in the States. And so I'm not, like, listen, I'm not trying to deny that there was a study in the 1920s that was actually done, There was a higher mortality rate of children in these residential schools relative to the population. And you have to realize the residential school system was like the lib option of the time. It was framed as we're civilizing these, poor, destitute people. But there was a lot of abuse. There was a lot of trauma. There was a lot of things that is legitimate to represent in the work of art. But I think that Monkman piece being done at the time when churches were burning and so on and so forth, like, to me, I think that it places a lower, more politicized significance on that work as opposed to the work of Indigenous artists like Norval Morrisseau. And to me, I think what was so great about the Morrisseau paintings was the transcendence of that, and the way that he painted, the way that he can just mentally come up with things, not even with a sketch. Although I think he probably did some sketching, but not to like reify it too much, not to like do the Noble Savage thing too much, but the way that he would work on an intuitive level, because he said, "My spirits, my ancestors come to me when I'm painting." To me, that is worth an infinity more content and artistic practice and the transcendence of what has been done to Indigenous people. To me, that to keep that tradition and carry it forward and to do a syncretic fusion of something that was a very very intense sticking point with that history of it, but to go through it anyways and to come out with a positive vision, to me that will be worth that is worth so much more for the preservation of Indigenous art. And I know as a white person, I know I'm speaking as an outsider, whatever. Let me do that disclaimer, right? But in terms of the outside looking in, what Morrisseau was trying to do, to me, was more significant on an artistic and spiritual level than to do the upteenth activist art piece about the residential schools. Because let's face it, a lot of these Indigenous artists in Canada, they do live in the shadow of greats like Norval Morrisseau. But they're not doing what he was trying to do. He was an actual shaman doing a spiritual form of art and aesthetics. Whereas a lot of the activist art that you see, the very badly conducted, you can tell they're getting some kind of culture grant in these university art programs that these academics love to jammer on about all day. Like, a lot of it's like, you've seen it. It's there's something that's very played out about it. You know what I mean? Because you know why these academics are promoting them? For its political content. That's why. Whereas you look at the artwork by Norval Morrisseau and other Indigenous artists, there was I forget her name. I apologize for forgetting her name. But when you go into the one entrance of the Morrisseau exhibit, there was this Indigenous artist woman who I believe is more contemporary. I think the piece may have come out in the 2010s, where it was in the same style as Morrisseau, of that sort of like Salish Ojibwe art, but it was like I really love this composition. It was busier. It was I believe a prayer circle, but it was done in that style. And some people go like, "Oh, that's like flat design." It's not flat design. Now, flat design may have been inspired by a lot of the more traditional aesthetic depictions within Indigenous art, within certain elements of Chinese art, and so on and so forth. There's like a long history of flat design. But I would not soil this great work by calling it flat design. It's not that. Because there's a difference between depicting in various spiritual forms of artwork and aesthetics, whether it be Indigenous art in North America, whether it be the Icaros in South America, whether it be Greek, Orthodox iconography and Byzantine art. There is a purposeful reason. There's a purpose and a reason why the human figure is depicted in such a evanescent and ethereal way. I talked about this in my interview that hopefully will come out soon with Shane Swanson. Whereas like flat design is clearly a bastardization of it and serves no spiritual purpose whatsoever. It is really an effacement of the human form rather than a spiritualized depiction of the fully fleshed out, soulful representation of the human form that you find in Orthodox iconography or in different forms of indigenous art, or in Chinese literati painting, whenever they do depict figures, it's a different thing fundamentally than quote unquote flat design. But anyway, yeah, there was a number of Morrisseau paintings. They had a lot of his floral work that I quite enjoy. And the thing about Norval Morrisseau is that he was taking the tradition that he grew up in. He was taking traditional depictions of indigenous art, but he was responding to, in his own unique way, the times he was living in terms of the greater art world as a whole. He was responding to things like the New York School, like Hard Edge, like abstract expressionism as a whole, but he was still willing to depict the figure in his work. And so the art world, the contemporary art world at the time, or whatever you want to call it, modern art, really did embrace him in that sense. And I think that, to me, it's one of the best representations of an artist that is steeped within a sense of his own culture and his own people, but also finding ways without cheapening or kitschifying the traditions of his ancestors, finding a way to embrace the sort of newness and the vitality and the flavor of the art world at the time, even if it was something that was unconscious, because he was, in a lot of ways, painting what he saw with what Morris Graves, another very famous artist, and called the inner eye of the artist. So, yeah, Norval Morrisseau is truly a legend, and I might end up doing a whole episode on him. He lived a quite interesting and in a lot of ways very tragic life. And then moving on to the retrospective of the Group of Seven. And it's hard really because of the wide body of paintings and of members of the Group of Seven, to which I also include their affiliates like Emily Carr. It's hard really to qualify what is ostensibly a unified movement, but unified in terms of subject matter, which is the Canadian landscape, but not unified in terms of style. There are some, such as Lauren Harris, who took a very academic approach and went to the farthest regions, bordering just upon the arrival of abstract expressionism. And it's very funny. There was, I think it was either Robert Hughes or it was another art critic that noted, I believe it was another documentary you can find on YouTube on modern art, that said it's very funny how a lot of the European avant-garde in the early to middle to later 20th century, how they completely rejected Impressionism, except for, I think it was Picasso that said he didn't like any of the Impressionists except for Cezanne, because Cezanne was doing something that you could easily see linked itself to later developments in European painting, with Cubism and the various like blue and red periods of Picasso. And then later with certain surrealists, you could see the connection, such as Yves Tanguy. Yves Tanguy is a good example. But when it comes to the rebirth of Impressionism, it's in North America where Impressionism truly landed. In America, you have abstract expressionism that came later. But before that, you have a lot of Canadian artists. Some of them, like William Blair Bruce, were precursors to the Group of Seven that actually studied in Europe. I believe he even studied under Monet, William Blair Bruce. And then he came back. I told this story before about my favorite painting, or rather my father's favorite painting of William Blair Bruce that he saw when he was a kid in the Hamilton Gallery, called A Phantom in the Snow. And I did a whole video on this when I used to do the Modern Art Madness ones. So the Group of Seven, a lot of them have very different stylistic choices. Lauren Harris, he's doing something very flat. He's doing something at the farthest reaches of color. And you have other ones who are doing sort of like a pure landscape, like Valerie and Tom Thompson. And then you have others who are sort of, you could tell they're creating stylistic choices with the landscape, such as Lionel Fitzgerald. And he, with his trees and with his more, he was, willing to incorporate different houses and townhouses and bridges and so on and so forth. But his stylistic choices with trees, in a lot of ways, you have around the First World War, you have painters that were doing landscape still in Europe that found a kinship with the group of seven. For example, a painter from Canada that was in World War One. If you look up the works of Frederick Varley, when Varley, he was doing something, and a lot of it was because they had probably, I could imagine, limited resources on the front in terms of pigments. But if you look at the British painters around World War One, such as Paul Nash, you look at even some of the German painters, you see this relationship, even just in terms of their color choices of what the visual appeal was and what the sensuous nature of that gray, dirty, abominable landscape of the front line in World War One, of the trenches. And Varley becomes very famous for depicting a gas attack. So Paul Nash during the war as well, So then they come back to Canada. And if you look at a lot of the landscapes, there was one room where they had a very incredible Emily Carr, one of her smaller works, with these iconic trees that you'd find in British Columbia. Then they had a lot of, I forget who it was, it may have been J.E.H. MacDonald, who had these series of nocturnes of the Northern Lights. And you could see a tiny figure peering out over the landscape, looking into the stars, looking into the Northern Lights, and looking into the night sky. And it reminded me so much, and maybe because, I did my paper on this with my grad program, it reminded me of all of my studies. It suddenly flooded back to me, my studies of literati painting and the relationship between Taoism and Zen and the Chinese ink, Sumi ink paintings, the landscape in particular, where the fisherman or the small figure on the mountainside or the monk on the mountainside is usually small, demure, and in the corner. The figure does not represent a presence of the subject of the painting. It is not the full presence of the human experience the way it is in European landscape up until the 18th and 19th century, where the landscape takes precedence. Now you have, but in China they were doing something different, right? Whereas the landscape was always just the background for the drama of the figure, of the mythological figure, of the motif of humanly activity. That certain European painters like Poussin, you could tell like he was scaling it back. He was making the landscape, the mystical landscape, more present. But still, it was an invented landscape. And there was a lot of human activity because that's the nature of European art, is that even the forces of nature have been sufficiently colonized by human activity. And so this is why you have Impressionist painting that always there's a hint of like technology or human activity. Like even Monet, you have the trains. With Cezanne, even you have the townhouses. There's always a little hint of humanity. But in Canada, especially during a time when vast swaths of Canada, to this day even, have not been explored, or rather have only partially been explored, then you have the idea or the iconotype of the painter confronting wild nature. And so the group of seven took what they learned from Europe when Europe was beginning to turn its eye against Impressionism, against landscape painting. And they painted all that was around them. and it created something truly monumental. Because you have, but then of course, even though certain painters like Tom Thompson, they embody this like rugged spirit of encountering nature as it is, even if it is just a series of color dots, and there's only a little hint of suggestion that is a coherent landscape. You have still a lot of invention that has come out of it. An invention of stylistic choices. Now, there's certain painters like Casson, for example, that they put right, I think it was Casson, that they put right next to the Tom Thompson section, the big wall, with all of his little oil studies, which I quite enjoy. I'll talk about a little bit later. But it was either him or J.H. McDonald. I think it was McDonald. That I'm like, oh, am I looking at another Tom Thompson? Then you look in the name, it's like, no, it's McDonald. And there was a salience there, but you could tell that they were doing something different. You could tell the brushwork was a bit different. And then you have other painters in the group of seven, like Edwin Holgate, where the landscape is very, almost like, I don't know what you could compare it to. You can compare it to like woodcut or printmaking, or even, even a silk screen in some certain ways, because he's creating an invention. He's abstracting the landscape to its furthest reaches, the way that Lawrence Harris did. But then you have other ones that, of course, that you could tell he was doing on location. But even on location, I notice this when I go outside and paint, that there still is an element of invention. And that invention is born out of necessity, of just being there, having a short amount of time to do it. You don't want to be out there all day. The weather's changing, and so on and so forth. And I believe Holgate did do a number of woodcuts and things of that nature. So, because a lot of these people, you gotta realize, back in the day, a lot of painters got started as commercial artists. Even Tom Thompson himself started off as a commercial artist, working in America and then later going to Canada. And I have here, I'm not going to read the whole thing because honestly, like, unless you're a painter, it's kind of boring. But you have a materials list or analysis of Tom Thompson's work, and he used quite a different number of hues and colors, reds, oxides. He favored lead white because, and you could tell by looking at it, that it's a very milky, creamy, almost yellowish type of white, as opposed to titanium white. And he favored that because it could mimic easily the sort of natural light, right? And an equivalent nowadays, because a lot of painters most painters don't use lead. Some of them, they're still devoted to it. Some oil painters, but portrait painters especially. But I think the approximation for modern painters would be zinc white. I use zinc white because it's a great mixing white. It doesn't create a sort of like opaque milkiness if you just wanted to like lighten up a color. I discovered this recently. I always used to just use titanium, but anyways. So Tom Thompson, he also was doing something that a lot of modern plein air painters discovered, which is that he would often leave, when he was working on canvas, when he was working on bigger works, he would cover it in a white, an opaque white coat, like after the gessoing, the structure of like the tooth of what holds the paint on the canvas. But what he would do is he would often leave little marks of the wood panel that he was painting on that would show through the painting. And often that's born out of necessity because you're working very fast, and if you have a warmer tone, which often a lot of birch wood panels, they create a sort of lighter, warmer tone. For example, I've done this where I will put sealant on the panel that I'm using, but then I'll use clear gesso so I could still have the color of the wood, and it's a very nice warm brown that you're painting over. And so what he would do is he would often, he would do hundreds of these sketches, these little oil sketches, on location, on plein air. And so I think out of necessity, he realized that sometimes if you leave a little bit showing through, that it could often mimic ground rocks, certain parts of the sky, it gave the painting more interest. But then later on, Tom Thompson realized and when you were in the McMichael Gallery and you were going on the wall, and there's like, I believe, 3 rows deep of his different paintings, 2 or 3 rows, because they're small sketches that you could tell, because I work at that scale, and so it was very significant to me because I had looked at these paintings from the time I was a little kid to then later grow up and become a plein air painter, and then using the same scale of the picture itself. And it was something very meaningful to me because I've always worked at like a smaller to medium scale. Maybe one day I'll break out and do bigger things. I mean, the Zarathustra series to me is about like middle to bigger range, but they're smaller pictures because I'm doing illuminations with them, so they're like smaller pictures into one. You'll see in time. You'll see in time. Don't worry about it. So yeah, so the Tom Thompson wall, and then it was either McDonald or Varley next to him, or Casson, and you could tell that he was fitting in a lot of the landscape within such a small panel. That he was doing a composition. A lot of them were very similar to, if you look up the compositions of Edgar Payne. But he was doing something with them that was so brilliant. And he was mimicking the vastness of the landscape in such a small frame that, a lot of times it takes landscape painters to have a fully fleshed, larger painting to fit so much content in. And, I was sitting there and I was like, well, I've been looking at these since I was a kid, but then when you are confronted by them and you see how small they actually are, it does something. It gives it a new depth. And then, of course, later, Tom Thompson, he sort of strayed into what you would say are the classical hallmarks of Impressionism, where he was playing around with the color, and he was playing around with more pastel hues, and he wasn't really paying attention to a sort of similitude to what he was seeing directly, but rather something that was more expressive. And the reason I always gravitated to Tom Thompson is because, in terms of his brushstroke, he definitely favored less of like what you would call the pointillist or picky or chicken scratch type of minor little gestural strokes of a lot of other landscape painters, which is something I'm very frustrated with because I've often tried to do this where you are creating how shall I say it, like a polyphony of different strokes and gestures and colors that are minute and discrete but then come together. Whereas Tom Thompson, he favored those large, sweeping gestural strokes, and he was able to do less with more in that regard. He was able to do broken color and visible brush strokes, but do it in a way that isn't very picky and very minute. He preferred very bold and flavorful strokes. I know it kind of sounds stupid. It kind of sounds like the way Anthony Fonuctano describes what my friend Matthew Stout said of the best. Anthony Fantano does not describe music. He doesn't review music. He describes sounds. He's talking about like chunky riffs, right? Like it's trying to find, but it makes sense in terms of visual art, though. It makes sense. So he preferred those very wide, very bold gestural brushstrokes, which is something I've always appreciated and I've always liked. And I think because for some reason I gravitate towards that, and I could really see it when I was actually looking at them. Whereas I've always wanted to be like the more professional, how should I say it? The more professional, the more like polished landscape painters. Not polished in a sense, but rather they have a unique style that is one that is more in tune with the other members of the group of seven. You can see this with like a lot of contemporary plein air painters, where there's a million little strokes everywhere, and some parts of it can be quite illustrative, even though they are on location and they are trying to capture the light. I guess a contemporary landscape painter you could compare. I really can't find any to compare to Tom Thompson. Maybe Jim McVickers, but I mean, I'd have to research more, but really there's no comparison in my mind. So I can only, you know, I could only achieve in my lifetime essentially a tenth of what Tom Thompson achieved when it comes to the landscape, if not less than a tenth, right? Then, you have other ones that were there. I remember looking at, who was it? I think it was it Frank Johnston, or was it Frederick Varley, or I remember looking in particular. Oh yes, yes, G.H. MacDonald. I remember looking at a lot of his landscapes. The famous one with the two canoes. That the light is very yellowish, the landscape is very brownish and sienna-like, and there are blues, but they're being cut up by these sequences of red. That a lot of the nature scenes you would find in Algonquin Park or in Algoma, and especially during the fall, that was like their favorite time to paint. There was one in particular he did that's just basically the fall trees, and it's just bright colors of red, like a firecracker. And I remember looking at that and I said, there's so many instances in public places and people's homes that I've been to, in very I remember going on like field trips to this cabin or nature resort or whatever, and you'd see one on the wall. The Wild River, that's the one I'm looking for. The Wild River. No date, but he may have done this around the 20s or so. And there's so many of them that have that grayish brown and yellowish hue that was very indicative of the group of seven by a lot of their color choices. And some of them don't have that. Some of them can be quite bright and brilliant, and especially the ones of the skyscapes, they're bordering on nocturnes. And then the funny thing is that J.H. MacDonald, he would then switch up his palette. His mountain scenes were very blue, very cool, very grayish, and sort of lacked the ones that you'd find in lacked the sort of yellowy brown sienna-like pigments that you'd find in a lot of his wilderness paintings. And I remember looking at that, I'm like, there's so many instances where I've seen this, but they just recess into the background. But when you do see them, then it dawns on you that yes, this is a uniquely Canadian aesthetic. There is something about the very soil, the very landscape of this country that produces that look. I'm going to get to Lorne Harris and then Maurice and Venice. And then I'm going to go into more academic, in the paid version of this, I'm going to go into more academic works about the group of seven. And by the way, that Indigenous landscape painter I mentioned with the death masks and the Salish masks was Lawrence, I'm going to terribly butcher this, I'm very sorry, Lawrence Paul Yuxwalaputin. I highly recommend his work. I mean, some of it can be kind of kitschy and posterish, and he's doing a lot of pop art, but I quite like it. I think this sort of illustrative style with very bold colors that's indicative of pop art, but doing it in a way that honors his Indigenous heritage and tradition. I mean, that's really great. There's other landscapes that I felt were kind of a bit much, like the more contemporary ones. I'm like, well, they had some good ones by Helen McNichol comes to mind. They had and David Milne. That I'm just looking at the playbill they have on the McMichael website, and then I'm going to cover Maurice and Venice. But then they had A.Y. Jackson as well. I told this story before, where I actually, in a local used bookstore, I ended up finding a book that was actually signed by A.Y. Jackson. I think in the 70s, right before he died, I think his daughter had curated a book of his drawings. And they're brilliant drawings. And you could see that the way that he was treating the line in his pencil sketches was very similar to the way that a lot of art critics say that Van Gogh reinvented the line. And I remember I got it for a steal too because I was a student at the time, and the lady at the front took mercy on me, and she's like, "Well, I could tell, you're an artist and you really like." I'm like, I think I even said to her, I said, "You got to realize, like, these people are like gods to me. You know what I mean? Like, they're like everything. The group of seven to me is everything, And I think I bought it for like $50, and it had his name. I have his name, and it was awe-inspiring. There's this one that I remember they had. There's the famous trees from Algonquin by Tom Thompson. There's this one that he did in where is this? It says in 19. No, that's the collection. 1916. So during the war still. Early spring in Cocon Lake, and you could tell what I mean by the sort of visible wood panel and the large gestural strokes in such a small space of the landscape, of these small wood panels that he was using, that he could invoke such large sweeping brushstrokes. The way that a lot of painters will do color studies, even the sort of classic European painters will do color studies where they are purposely abstracting the subject matter to sort of play around with it and see in their mind how it looks. I believe Poussin did a number of these studies because he would have these little wax figurines he would make, and then he would put them in a diorama, and then he would paint these color studies. I believe Burne-Jones in the Pre-Raphaelites also discovered this technique of doing these very completed yet abstract-looking color studies that would then inform the larger works. For example, I think when it comes to Burne-Jones, I quite like the color studies better. Maybe because that's the way I paint, and sometimes I've often done like these faceless figures that way. But there's something about it. I quite enjoy it. And J.H. MacDonald also was one that was a master at doing these like large sweeping gestural strokes. This one painting that they have on the website, it's called Cathedral Peak in Lake O'Hara from 1927. And again, you could see that the background color, not necessarily grisaille, that's the background sketch, but the sort of the toned canvas or toned panel of yellow ochre, you could tell he's using that to make a very quick landscape painting. Because he realizes, and I've often discovered this as well as a plein air painter, I've always liked like red and ochreish, and sometimes I'll paint on blue panels. But I've often discovered that if you have a warm tone, that you can easily paint over the sky with blues, and you can easily incorporate them into the landscape, and it saves you time, it saves you energy, and it creates a visual interest by breaking up the color with a unified color. And so in this case, in this painting from 1927, a Cathedral Peak, it's got this uniform yellowish ochre tone throughout the whole piece. But he's putting greens on top of it from the recesses of the tree lines, and he's putting blues and grays in the mountains, and this like vibrant splash of teal in the middle, in the lake, Lake O'Hare. So these people, they invented this. You know what I mean? I mean, they didn't it's debatable the techniques that they invented, but certainly in a lot of the sort of tips and tricks that a lot of contemporary plein air painters do, people that paint outside, definitely they revolutionized a lot of these techniques. And so I really appreciate that. And then we get to Lauren Harris, which is really one of the most iconic Canadian artists of all time. They had one of his most iconic ones of Pick Island, which I actually did a sketch of. Maybe I'll include in my sketch, because me and my girlfriend we were both sitting there and sketching, and she did something that's a bit more polished, but then she looks over at what I was doing, and she's like, immediately I can tell like an artist actually did this because of your strokes and because of the way that you navigate space, with practice over time. It only took me about, I would say, not even 20 minutes to do a pencil sketch, because when you go to the McMichael, you can't use any you can't use paint and you can't use ink inside the gallery, which I think is stupid. But I guess they're worried about someone splashing ink or paint everywhere, so you can only use graphite. And so we were doing our sketches. I remember she had this comment. She said, it's almost like Botero was like doing a landscape painting because of the way that he smoothed out the edges and he rounded them off, and he was doing something that really was an invention. That's not how Pick Island actually looks like, but he's doing something in terms of the tone and the color that was a precursor to abstract expressionism, and then later movements of the same ilk, such as lyrical abstraction. And then I think he was also in communion with certain American artists, post-impressionists such as, and expressionists such as Georgia O'Keeffe. I think he was friends with Georgia O'Keeffe, and he actually went there to the Mesa in New Mexico with his wife. And they had some of his wife's paintings as well, and she's actually quite a good painter. There's some works of hers that I enjoy a bit better than Lauren Harris. But there is a lot of discussion around the concept of an invention of the landscape. I think it's a responsibility I have to do an episode on Norval Morrisseau and to do an episode on Lauren Harris, because both of them have very, very interesting backstories, and I think can be fleshed out in a certain way as an artist myself, and appreciating that journey of going to the depths of and exploring what you can truly be capable of in the work of art. I'm going to, before we take a little bit of a break, music break before the paywall, I'll read you a little bit about Lauren Harris, but let me go to Morrice in Venice. Now, James Wilson Morrice was a precursor. He was a post-impressionist. He was a precursor to the Group of Seven. And I was very fortunate to see this limited exhibit of his work from Venice. And he was a painter, along with William Blair Bruce, that actually went to Europe, learned from the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, and then came back to Canada and informed a lot of the Canadian artists that would then later culminate into the Group of Seven. And I was very pleasantly surprised. I highly recommend going and looking it up. I don't know if I want to drop $80 on the book that they had there, but I'm like, well, maybe. Maybe if you subscribe to my Patreon, I could do a whole episode of Morrice. Patreon.com/GeneralProductions or Substack.com/HeWasContent Corner. Then I could afford, dropping $80 on an art book. I mean, I have done this in the past, but anyways, I want my beautiful pay angels to know that their funds are not being wasted on lavish expenses like a lot of other YouTubers and grifters that I know, or rather don't know, but I've heard of. They take little quarterings of their audience monies to spend on nonsense. I probably should edit that one out because I don't want to cheapen this thing. But anyways, so Morrice in Venice, let me read you from the website. And I was quite pleasantly surprised because when you see a lot of Venetian art, rather artwork that depicts the various aquifers and canals and cityscapes of Venice, he had a totally different approach to it. A very impressionist and post-impressionistic approach, which is something that this blurb of the McMichael Gallery actually says. And I highly recommend viewing them because you could tell that he had only a small amount of time to do these studies. A lot of them were on smaller panels. There was actually some boomer woman that I was like, she was talking about it. And I said, well, I appreciate the smaller ones. She's like, I didn't really like the smaller ones in this one particular part of the room. And the other part, they were better. I said, I like the smaller ones because with such a limited amount of space, every little gestural stroke makes a difference in the composition. And the way that he navigated the very complicated brickwork and buildings and the channels And the people that were there with these huge sweeping gestural strokes in a very small place, they very much are indicative of Tom Thomson. You could tell where Tom Thomson's getting a lot of inspiration. And the women that he would paint, that there were like common Venetian women that were walking about, and there was one nocturne with a woman and her little girl that was quite incredible. And it was a very simple composition relative to the other ones, because when you view a lot of art from Venice, the composition demands a level of illustrative detail, if you will. Whereas he was very good at navigating this detail by doing very impressionistic brushwork. And so, to me, it was incredible because I wasn't looking simply at art that is in Venice from the great old masters, but you were looking at something very fresh and very momentary, because I could imagine being a plein air painter in Venice is quite a complicated task. To break down what you were seeing in front of you into very simple gestural strokes. And the women he painted were amazing. They all have the typical Italian, schmucks and coats. And so let me read you. So this gallery, Morrice in Venice, was curated by Sandra Pekowski, CM, is Canadian art historian, academic curator, and writer whose career spans 5 decades. A professor emerita at Concordia University. She was a longtime editor and publisher of the Journal of Canadian Art History. Was appointed to the Order of Canada in 2015. Well, I can almost guarantee you that a terrible monster such as myself, a terrible, just a, I don't know if I should say this. Because I don't think I'm great enough. I don't think I'm, that good. But also, I don't know, whatever, my political beliefs. I remember we were walking up to the attic, the upper portion, the attic of the McMichael, to see the Morrisseau exhibit. And I remember saying to my GF, I said, what really bugs me is that my works will probably never in a million years be in these walls. And they'll never be written about by the Canadian Journal of Art History. They'll never receive any recognition in the National Gallery, whether it's in Toronto or in BC or the various other national galleries throughout Canada. The big one in Ottawa is quite good as well. And she said, "Oh, don't blackpill, don't blackpill too much." But no, but I mean, it's a far off dream, and it's an impossible dream. And maybe my hope, not specifically me, because I don't really regard my artwork that high. Well, I do and I don't. I want to totally cheapen my output. But in terms of the artists that I saw, the ones that I have been worshiping since I was a little kid, I would never claim to be on their level at all. And so, but even the artists that are featured there that are more contemporary, it's so don't think of it as me. I'm saying some kind of sour grapes thing, because whether I be recognized as a great Canadian artist is not up to me. It would be nice one day, but who knows, right? But I think someone like me, my hope is that in the future, Canada finds itself, and through these great works of art, finds itself. So even someone like me, or approximating someone who falls outside of the current social, cultural, political orthodoxies of the now, the given, that maybe in the future, who knows, someone who even explicitly in their artwork rebels against the given can be given a voice. Because you have to realize, it's part of this paper I'm going to read, the Group of Seven was an explicitly nationalistic project. That's not to say that it's artwork. Every individual artwork is inherently political or is a vehicle of propaganda or so on and so forth. But nationalistic in the truest sense of what politics was in terms of the ancient regime or in terms of pre-modernity, where politics is an expression. It's the active phenomenological expression of a culture, right? Which is, I guess, very Spenglerian, but so anyways, but besides that, Maurice in Venice. Sorry, I was getting a bit wistful there. Maurice in Venice. So here, let me read you. And so another thing too, the reason I was saying that because I was thinking about, I guess Sandra Pulowski would be horrified at someone like me talking about Maurice in Venice. But anyways, the McMichael proudly presents Maurice in Venice, an exhibit celebrating James Wilson Morrice's evocative depictions of one of Europe's most enchanted cities, inspired by the pioneering research of Sandra Pulowski. This exhibit showcases a stunning selection of Morrice's canvases, pochades, and sketches. Pochade meaning the small pochade box that would fit these small panels. And so you'd set them up. Sometimes they would make them out of cigar boxes that you would set up in a moment and you'd paint. First artist to make regular visits to Venice, traveling there frequently he was born 1865 to 1924. Traveled from the mid-1890s to around 1908, in the era when Venice was the premier destination for artists across Europe. Morrice has distinguished himself as one of the few foreign painters who returned repeatedly to the storied canals and piazzas. His Venetian works earned widespread acclaim, appearing in exhibits throughout Europe, including Paris and London, as well as in Tirana and Montreal, his hometown, Toronto. Unlike many of his contemporaries who gravitated towards sweeping, picturesque views of Venice, which, I mean, some of them border on kitsch, Morrice focused on capturing its quieter, more intimate moments. His paintings reveal the subtle beauty of the city's secluded calles, tranquil squares, and lively public spaces, rendered with a masterful interplay of light and color. Whether viewed from a cafe table or through the window path of Venice's labyrinthine streets, Morrice's work offers a deeper personal and atmospheric glimpse into the soul of the city. And I would say the atmospheric, the way that the impressionistic color and the impressionistic stroke, very similar to, like, I guess the equivalent would be a lot of digital art nowadays, although I wouldn't put them in the same category. The atmospheric element of these combination of visible strokes and colors coming together to suggest an image that creates a very wavy, almost like I guess another digital metaphor would be like a pre-rendering of a space. And there's something to it that I quite enjoyed from a very early age. And that's why I always gravitated towards the impressionistic stroke. But when I was seeing them, being Italian myself, it was very interesting how he approached the Venetian landscape in a way that only a Canadian painter or only an impressionistic painter could do, or a post-impressionist. In that he could create this atmosphere with these very gestural, very visible brushstrokes, and create these figures with only a few sweeping jabs of color. And it was very much like, a lot of the subject matter, the way that the people looked, grounds it in that era of Italy. But if you focus on just the landscapes, it's very contemporary in a way. And it's very interesting how he's doing these sketches that are even further down the road of doing in as quick as possible, as little space as possible, on location, a painting that rivals the later post-impressionists in terms of that venture into abstraction that we find in the later 19th and 20th century. Right? So I think in terms of a transition from European art to what Canada then later produced with the Group of Seven and with others, Morrice in Venice is a huge jump-off point. It's to say that this style is now going to depict the old world in a way that speaks to the landscape of the new world. And so there was something very critical there, which leads me to this paper on Lauren Harris and Emily Carr that was written by a university student in, where is this from? Is it the University of Tirana? Or is it, no, Simon Fraser University. There you go. Simon Fraser University by Olivia Vesser. And let me just read you a few excerpts about Lauren Harris and Emily Carr. And so here's in the middle of the essay. Harris' relationship with Carr is best represented in their archival letters from the Royal BC Museum of Victoria, British Columbia. His letters to Carr are brimming with idealistic conceptions about Canadian landscape, which undoubtedly made an impression on her aesthetic. In one undated letter, he divulges his plan for an Arctic expedition with a group of 7. Very similar in some ways to, and you know what's crazy? I have to mention this, but I'll probably flesh it out more when I do an episode on Lauren Harris. Very similar to another episode I did on another great man of art, Nikolai Roerich. Because Harris was a theosophist. And so it makes a lot of sense if you look at his landscapes, you look at the diagrammistic abstract paintings of Helena af Klimt, and you'll see the connection there. Right? I'll go into it a bit more when I do that episode. I am in great need of losing my littleness and sharing completely with life of the universe and waters and skies and land and light, Harris says. Upon returning, however, he describes his experience as having been unfulfilling, alluding to his preference for Western landscapes. I'm painting some of the Arctic things, not bad, but nothing to usher the soul into eternal bliss. Still, he adds that, and of course Emily Carr would disagree with him for a variety of reasons. Still, he adds that he is trying to get up to the summit of my soul and work from there where the universe sings. In other letters, he remarks on the group of 7's shared appreciation for the West, such as that expressed by landscape painter Arthur Lismer. After one of Lismer's trips, Harris notes that the Western environment had captured his partner as well. Evidently, quote, evidently the Great Plains and the mountains inspire a forward-looking life despite depression. That zest will keep this country alive and creative. His recurrent use of romantic-style imagery to describe the terrain corresponds with the early Canadian landscape movement. He frequently speaks of the spirit of artistry, which he connects to sublime notions of self, and shares the need, again, theosophy, and shares the need to escape his own littleness with Carr, who also expresses discontentment with non-Western landscapes. Ultimately, the idea about selfhood, artistic representation, and the aesthetic of landscape shape their conversations and eventually finds their way into Growing Pains, her last published work. His expertise, moreover, might be seen to have seemed to catalyze her understanding of herself as a woman and landscape painter, and the very form of her landscape paintings assumed. Even so, the very absence of the Indigenous in his work is a point of departure. Oh, but of course, Emily Carr is considered evil, Western colonialist, cultural G-word-eyed for daring to depict as a white woman the Indigenous people, even though she meant it as a sign of great respect and reverence. But, see, how that works? See how that works? How media literacy and authorial intention, when these people say it's applicable, but when it counteracts their lib narrative, then it's not applicable to Emily Carr. But, okay, whatever. I know I get angry at this bait, but I just have to point that out. But also an influence on Carr, who would, upon his urgings, remove any Indigenous presence from her work. Art historian Alison McDuffie regards Harris's depiction of Northern Canada as exhilarating yet strangely empty, pointing to the seemingly intentional absence of Indigenous people in his work. I don't know if it was that intentional, but I guess he wanted a sort of pure form of nature that was, in his own view, spiritualized. Andrew Baldwin views Harris's artwork as stemming from nationalist ambitions along with his efforts to capture in aesthetic form what he perceived to be the essence of Canadian experience, an idealized wilderness synonymous with the Canadian North. He argues that landscapes, quote, were not merely interpretations. They were the result of Harris's earnest desire to paint the Canadian scene in its own terms. It is clear Harris found these landscapes inspiring. Harris's letters to her, dated only as June, posits that we should saturate, quote, we should saturate ourselves in our own place, the trees, skies, earth, and rock, and let our art grow out of these. He then declares that he, quote, cannot yet feel the abstract painting has greater possibilities of depth and meaning than art based on natural forms. I have seen almost no abstract things that have that deep resonance that stirs and answers and satisfies the soul. So he goes very close to abstraction, but he pulls back. And he says that's not part of the Canadian spirit. It is, but it isn't. It's not like what the New Yorkers were doing in terms of abstract expressionism that came after him. As an artist who gained early recognition for abstract depictions of urban cityscapes, his preoccupation with natural landscapes anticipates Carr's eventual progress towards depicting Western terrains exclusively. Carr's responds effusively to his praise and support. In one instance, he addresses one of her paintings, quote, the Indian Church, which evokes a white clapboard church in Yukut, British Columbia, which almost shrinks before the pulsing forest by which it is surrounded. She remembers Harris hanging the painting above his dinner table and his subsequent preoccupation with this particular work. In an archived letter dated June, he notes that he saw considerable art in Europe, adding that he, quote, would rather have the Indian Church than anything I saw. While she appreciates his adulteration of her work, it becomes clear that his preoccupation is related to a similar sentiment about national identity he expresses later in the same letter. Quote, but I have no idea, confirmed by what I felt in Europe, that we here in our own place are new land where a new race is forming. Whoa! We'll find for the present and perhaps for some times to come that the fullest life in art for us comes by way of nature. Oh my God. So he's, again, noting the unique genesis of a new Canadian people. Notwithstanding his optimism, the Indian Church also represents an intersection of Canadian and Indigenous identities that was exploited by landscape painters for their own agenda. Okay, here we go. This comes from Southern Fraser University, folks, so they have to mention that. One of his letters confirms that which Carr concurs. In another letter, he encourages Carr and elevates her Western approach to landscape and valuing her work and saluting it. However, problematically, alongside Indigenous artistry, your things breathe, the rest do not quite. Your things live with the best of the Indigenous totemic art, and the Indigenous art at its best is positively great. The works of all the others who have visited the coast have in no case quite got it. He claims to recognize unique quality in her work, an appreciation for the unique landscapes of the Canadian West Coast, which he sees as comparable to the originality and superlative quality of Indigenous art forms. So he wasn't like totally knocking it. He was saying, yeah, that's also a part of Canada. I mean, come on. Anyways, but it's university grad paper, so, you know. In her autobiography, Carr also clearly attributes her identity as an artist to her distinct experience with the Western Canadian landscape, which informs the entirety of her life. She fondly remembers the up and downness of the Rockies, their tops dangling in clouds, describing them as part of a natural me. In Growing Pains, her book, which I think I have a copy of, or I have to get a copy of, a phrase that suggests to what extent she herself, as an extension of place, when embarking on her art school travels, she reflects on her connection with Canada with a possessive language by describing an aching homesickness for my West. In England, she remembers, missing the meandering snake fence, the pine tree overtop, the red substantial cow, the knee-deep chewing among the lilies. She reiterates her positiveness of place when she exclaims about, quote, the gladness of my West again. Upon returning to Vancouver Island, her desire to be something new, much like Canada itself, is aptly reflected in her remark that despite her English heritage, she is, quote, born and bred Canadian. Nevertheless, despite my Italian ancestry, I am born and bred Canadian. So there you go. Nevertheless, even Eastern Canada's scenery pales in comparison to what she reveres in Growing Pains as the Great West. She scorns the East, prairie houses, and barns drowned in loneliness, emphasizing the nothingness of the Atlantic. Oh my God, she really is doing like a heckin' regionalism, which I think is quite fascinating. She situates her identity in the close proximity to the West because it differentiates her as a woman and Canadian artist from other male artists during the period oversaturated with art produced by male, European, and American artists. Carr depicts America and English societies in negative terms as a contrast to her depiction of Western Canada. As Susan Egan observes, all her writings express her passion, not just for Canada, an explicit contrast to England, but specifically for the West Coast. She plainly refers to Canada and the United States as a new, clean countries, which positively distinguishes them from England. Nevertheless, she perceives Americans in San Francisco is in a judgmental light, often highlighting persons who are lower class, such as the colorless girl who produced studies as anemic and flavorless as herself. The result is the work she produces in San Francisco is also, quote, humdrum and unemotional, objects honestly portrayed, nothing more. Wow, I wonder if she was sensing the kind of like weird spiritual sickness in California that people I know from California talk about, that you could like feel it in the air. The result that in England she scoffs the small pettiness of Devonshire and wonders why her parents praised it so highly growing up. She questions if their years in Canada would have made the country as small and as pinched as it appears to her at first glance. Even though she appreciates the stony fields and wind-blown trees of Cornwall, she remarks that the landscape is punished with tameness and is wild, but not with the volume of Canadian wilderness. Again, direct contrast between North American landscape painting and the landscape is depicted in Europe, very close to being manicured. And I remember when I was in grad school, I read that James C. Scott book, and he talked about the field rose, the curated forests in Germany, and that has a lot of bearing on like what Heidegger says, and even you could mention that as it relates to Impressionism in Europe as opposed to the Canadian wilderness. She questions their use in Canada, even though she appreciates the stony fields windblown Cornwall. She remarks landscapes punished with tameness. Her experience of London conveys her frustration with its lack of natural spaces. She notes that the, quote, open country turned to human congestion and describes the ache of overcrowded space. The painting aesthetic of both America and England by this point were not informed by the sublime, an aesthetic towards which Carr aspires in her artwork and sees as important to and even characteristic of Canada, the sublime. Recognizes that Carr saw the more depth in places than in people. Egan understands that her identity, at least the identity she intended to portray, was rooted almost entirely in wilderness aesthetics and a sense of spirituality. She adds that Growing Pains was one of her attempts to control not just territory, but self-territory. Again, notice the spiritual overtones, which is evident in her selective nature of her landscape depictions, and confirmed again by the excerpts of letters she chose to include from Lauren Harris. And then talks about her as a writer. And so, but notice that there is an attempt to differentiate, which I'm going to talk about with these academic works more, to differentiate Canada from the old world of Europe and from America in a very pure, spiritual, and artistic sense that says something more than just the negative that I've talked about at the beginning of this podcast, the negative left-wing nationalism of contemporary Canada, contemporary leaf libs, that we're just not America and nothing else via negativa. No, that sense that we are not European as such, we are related to Europe, we come from Europe, but we are a founding of a different people. And we are not American. We have a totally different sensibility than America. That is a positive vision rather than a negative vision. So let's take a little bit of a music break. And for those listening, going to the paywall audio, please like, share, and subscribe. Click the bell. And join me on Patreon or Substack. We have a lot of very fun things to talk about when it comes to Canadian art. Thank you for listening to the Content Minded podcast. If you wish to support me and listen to every episode in full, then please go to patreon.com/giantartproductions and substack.com/Gio's Content Corner. There you will find the full archive of every content-minded episode, as well as every Giant Art Review episode, and exclusive to all patrons, the weekly Cole Report, where I break down interesting stories and discourse from throughout the week. Subscribe today to keep the content renaissance alive.